And welcome to the third session in the UBC Library Systematic and Scope and Review Workshop Series, Tools, Screening Criteria, and Appraisal. My name is Ursula Ellis. I'm one of the health librarians at Woodward Library, and I'm joined today by my colleague Vanessa Kitchen, who is the librarian for the Southern Medical Program at UBC Okanagan. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the UBC Vancouver campus, where I'm coming from today, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And the UBC Okanagan campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Sioux Okanagan Nation. And if you haven't seen these before, I'd really encourage you to take a look at the really excellent research guides from the Huihua Library here at UBC. They have really a wide range of resources. I would especially recommend taking a look at the Indigenous Research Methodology Guide, as well as the Decolonization and Anti-Racism Guide. And if you happen to be based at one of the UBC campuses, there are also guides about the relationships between Musqueam and UBC and the Sioux people and UBC Okanagan. So I'll just pop this link into the chat so that you have it for further exploration. Another link that I would like to share is the Systematic and Scope and Reviews Resource Guide here. The slides from today are posted here under the Workshop Resources tab of the guide, and the recording will go up here probably within a few weeks. So I'll just pop that into the chat as well. So our learning objectives for today are to know how to export search results from different databases and deduplicate for screening, test inclusion criteria for your systematic or scoping review, appraise the quality of evidence, and use tools to increase the openness and reproducibility of the review. And our agenda, first off, we'll be talking about covidence and using it to manage your screening process. We will have a brief break and then move into testing of inclusion, exclusion criteria, and considerations to take into account for screening. Another brief break. Then we'll talk about critical appraisal, data extraction and synthesis, and finally reproducibility, transparency, and retractions. And we will probably finish before 3 o'clock, probably 2:45 or 2:50 or so. Okay, so for using covidence, on this slide, there's kind of a general overview of the whole process. So as you're searching multiple databases for a systematic or scope and review, you're going to encounter a number of duplicates, and you'll need some way to manage those. Different librarians suggest different things. You could use some sort of citation management software, such as EndNote, Zotero, or Mendeley, to get rid of duplicates and then proceed with screening. But the tool that we often recommend using is covidence because it also has some facilities for deduplication. And there is a guide that gives an overview of export instructions for some of the major databases that are commonly used for systematic and scoping reviews. And that guide is the UBC Covidence Guide here under the Importing References section. This is where you can find some screenshots of how to export, and I'll be demonstrating some of these step by step in just a moment. But in terms of the step-by-step workflow, first you'd want to export references in RIS format in the majority of cases from the different databases that you're searching and save them in a folder. I would recommend that you organize these into little subfolders by database and keep track of those just in case something goes horribly wrong later with your covidence. You can kind of start fresh with your search results then. And next would be to import those RIS files into covidence, which it does a pretty good job of detecting and removing the duplicates. Then screen the titles and abstracts in covidence. You might consider sorting them by title so that you can more easily find any duplicates that might have slipped through and got through to that title and abstract screening stage. Screen the full text. I would recommend that you use the links that covidence will provide rather than uploading PDFs one by one into the tool. And then when you're finished screening your full text in covidence, you can export your included studies to whatever citation management software that you like in order to use the automatic citation facilities that those kind of tools provide. So something like Zotero, Mendeley, EndNote, all of those will help you create your bibliography automatically. That is a function that the Covidence tool cannot do. Okay, so let's start by talking about how to export results from Ovid databases into Covidence. So I'm going to open Ovid Medline. Okay, so I'll just do a simple search for the purposes of generating some search results to work with. Okay, so once you have your search results from your search, if you scroll down to this section above the first search result, there's a gray bar where you can export the references. If you have more than 1,000 references, what you'll need to do is use the range box here to break your references down into chunks of 1,000. So you could do 1 to 1,000, then 1,001 to 2,000. If you had fewer than 1,000 results, you could instead check the all box to export everything at once. So you'll then click export. And you'll need to change the format from RefWorks to RIS. And importantly, you'll also need to change the fields here to include the abstract so that you will have those in Covidence for your title and abstract screening. Next, you'll click export, and that will download a file of those references. And then you will go into Covidence and import them. So to get started with Covidence, I'm going to go back to our UBC Covidence guide here. If you don't already have a subscription set up, you'll want to go to this link, and you can self-sign up for an account as part of the UBC institutional subscription, as long as you're using an address ending in ubc.ca. And that does include the student.ubc.ca or alumni.ubc.ca accounts. And you will have access to this ongoing once you have left UBC as well as an alumni. Once you've got yourself set up with an account, you can then log into Covidence. Actually, I've already got it logged in on this tab, so just to save a moment, I'm going to flip over to that tab. So the first thing that you'll see when you sign into Covidence is a page that says Your Reviews. And this will be blank if you don't already have any pre-existing reviews. So you'll select Start a New Review, and then you'll have the option to give the review a name, adjust some of the settings of the review. And I will just go into an already created review here to show you what the next step would look like once you set the review up.
Ursula, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So we just had somebody in the chat ask about using links instead of uploading PDFs. Did we miss? Can you show us that?
Yeah, absolutely. In just a moment, I guess I'll kind of go through the import title and abstract, and then that will be on the full text screening stage. That'll probably be the natural place to talk about that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so once you've created a review, you'll have this sort of review dashboard page called the review summary. And this will also be blank the first time that you go into your review. And the first step would be to import references. So once you've exported references from a database like Ovid Medline, you will go into this import section, import into screen, and then choose the file. I didn't actually export from Ovid. I didn't hit the download button, but that would be sort of the thing that you would do is go find where that downloaded to and import. And if it's several hundred or 1,000 references, it is going to take probably a few minutes for all those to load up. And then you'll kind of carry on doing that. If you've got several batches of references from Medline, you'll go in and load those up one at a time. And then with your other databases, in turn, you'll load them all up. And if you make it an error, if you accidentally import something twice, there is a way to go back and undo the most recent import. As long as you haven't started screening any of the references in it, you can undo. So as you're importing from multiple databases, the duplicates that Covidence automatically finds will go into this area. And you can review them if you like. I have not actually ever found any errors in here, anything that has been falsely labeled as a duplicate, which isn't actually one. But if you do want to, for peace of mind, go through and review these. If you did find one that was not actually a duplicate, you can send it into the title and abstract screening area. So next, let's take a look at that title and abstract screening area. So if you click continue, this is basically how the title and abstract screening area looks. You can set up your settings so that 2 people are screening each title and abstract, which is best practice. Or you can also adjust things so it only takes 1 person to vote on each title and abstract. So how you have those settings set up will dictate what happens with the references at this stage. So if you vote no, maybe, or yes, and there is a second screener that's going to be involved, the reference will go into the awaiting other reviewer area. If it's just you making decisions, if you say no, the reference will go into the irrelevant references area. And then if you say yes or maybe, it will advance to the full text screening stage for a closer look. And where you can see those settings is from the review summary page. You can click settings. And I see that for a title and abstract screening, I've currently got it set to just 1 person needed to make a decision on each title and abstract, but 2 people required at the full text screening stage, as well as at the data extraction screening stage. This settings area is also where you can invite other reviewers. They don't have to be affiliated with UBC. Anybody is welcome to come and work on your review. It's just that people won't be able to set up their own reviews unless they have some sort of access to Covidence through UBC or their own institution. So at the full text screening stage, instead of having options of no, maybe, or yes, there's only include or exclude. There's no maybes. And if you do choose to exclude something, you will be prompted for the Prisma flow diagram to select a reason. And there's a lot of different default reasons that are populated here, but you can click on edit this list to add anything you like in the text box there. And for those links, you'll see that they appear right here under the title. So I would recommend that you use this to just click on the link, open it in a new window, and make a decision there, rather than uploading potentially hundreds of PDFs in here. There are reasons why that's tedious, that potentially is in conflict with some of the copyright considerations or licensing considerations that we have set up with some of our journal providers. At the data extraction stage, it probably makes more sense there to upload PDFs because you will want to have that easily handy as you're filling out that data extraction form. But for full text screening, it's probably sufficient to go out in another window. And if there's some annotation that you need to do, you can put it into this note field here.
Ursula, we have 2 questions. One is, do you mind going back to show how you change settings from title, abstract screening to full text?
Sure. So yeah, from that review summary page, it's under settings. And apologies for how slow everything is loading today. So it's the bottom part of this first tab here. So this is where you can change from 1 to 2 reviewers required for screen, which is what they call title and abstract screening. And then likewise, you have those choices available at full text and for data extraction. Did that answer your question?
She says thank you.
Great.
The second question is there any way we could also record exclusion reasons at the abstract review stage in Covidence?
Yeah, it's a little bit awkward, but there is a tagging function, which, let me go into that area. Okay, so if you click continue. So you can check the box next to a particular reference, go to tags. There are a couple that appear by default, ongoing study and awaiting classification. But again, you can add some text here, whatever you like. Maybe I don't want conference abstracts. So I'm entering that, create new, and now it's applied that tag. And then if I said no to this one, I could then go into the irrelevant references and use a filter to identify the conference abstracts in that section. Did that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, it's often not done, but it is something that folks have asked me about before, and that seems to be kind of the only way that you can easily do that in this tool. Up here under the Prisma button, you'll see that it's keeping track of all the decisions you've made. This is in sort of the classic Prisma diagram format. I would recommend that you select, once you're done, export data, and then copy the numbers over into, say, the Prisma 2020 flow diagram generator that was mentioned if you were at last week's session, if you do need that sort of more elaborate format. But this is so handy that it's keeping track of everything as you go automatically. And then I'm not really going to talk in depth about data extraction, and Vanessa will be talking about that later, but that is something that you can do either in this tool, or you can do all your screening in here and then export your included references to something like Excel and then carry on with your data extraction there. To export references, you can go to this button and you can export references at different stages. So title and abstract, full text review included. Okay, I'm just going to flip back over to the slides. So we showed this example of exporting from Ovid Medline. From Web of Science, it's a very similar sort of process. Select RIS as a format, and then you'll need to batch into groups of 1,000. And as well, under that importing references section of the Covidence guide, there are screenshots for other tools as well, like EBSCO or Scopus. Now, not every database will let you export in this format, and particularly if you're looking at sort of gray literature sources or individual journal web pages, Google Scholar. In those cases where there's not a handy way to export as RIS, what I would recommend is you use a citation management software tool like Zotero or EndNote or Mendeley. You can then create manually an entry within that tool for the thing that you want to import into Covidence. Then you can export from that tool into Covidence as a RIS. So it's a little bit awkward, but it is possible to get those sorts of gray literature types of things into the Covidence tool. And I just said Mendeley, but I'm not sure that Mendeley will actually let you export as a RIS file. Sometimes exporting from Mendeley can be problematic. Okay. So yeah, just to recap, you'll need that link that's on that Covidence guide in order to sign yourself up as part of the UBC library account. You'll definitely want to take that pathway. If you go directly to the Covidence website, there is an option to set up a free trial, but it's quite limited. Whereas you have the unlimited number of views, unlimited number of references that you can have in those reviews through the UBC library account. Another feature that's kind of handy for the title and abstract screening is the ability to highlight words related to your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you can set that up under the settings area. You can put in particular words that you'd like to have highlighted, either in green if they're related to your inclusion criteria, or red if they're things that you want to exclude. And I've already got that piece set up, and I'm going to click the show highlights. And I'm not seeing any. Okay, here's one. So I think in this case, I have set up the word COVID, words like PTSD, because this is the references in here primarily are about COVID and PTSD. So COVID is showing up in green, and I think words like review are showing up in red. So that can maybe be helpful with speeding up your screening a little bit if you're seeing those words kind of jump out. And as I mentioned, you can create tags to describe reasons for exclusion at the title and abstract stage. You can manage reviewer roles. There is a way to specify that, say, one reviewer is going to vote on every single reference at the title and abstract stage or at the full text screening stage, but then any second person could be the second vote on that reference. You can also set somebody up to be the person who resolves all conflicts at the title and abstract or full text screening stage, those cases where the two reviewers have voted differently. And just be aware that when you're deduplicating in Covidence, it will probably miss some duplicates. There can be a variety of reasons for that. Sometimes they truly are duplicates, like the exact same publication. Something that can help with that is to sort the references by title so that it's more likely that you're going to spot those two right next to each other. And then at the title and abstract screening stage, there's this duplicate that you can click that will send it into that duplicates area in a special category that says manually selected duplicates. It also shows you the full citation data when you're screening titles and abstracts. So it shows you the authors, it shows you the journal, the year. So that potentially could introduce some bias. That's something to keep in mind. Maybe that's not the tool for you if it's really, really important to you that you're only looking at titles and abstracts. And again, for indicating reasons for exclusion, that title and abstract screening tagging is the way to go about it. Okay, so let's take a few minute break. You can try out using Covidence or taking a look at a database that you're using for your review and just play around for a few minutes, and we will reconvene for the next part at 1:31. And we'll be here to answer questions if any come up for you. Okay. So moving along, let's talk now about some of the logistics and consideration around screening. So here's a few research findings from the methods literature on systematic and scoping reviews. It's been suggested that the average time to screen at the title and abstract stage is 30 seconds to 1 minute per reference. That's going to vary enormously depending on what your topic and your inclusion criteria are. Sometimes things are really easy to figure out just by looking at a title and abstract, whether they're going to be relevant or not. For other topics, it's going to be necessary to look at much more full text, or it will take more close reading of each title and abstract to determine eligibility. On average, about 3% of search results are included in the final review. And the reference to that paper there shows that that is another number that varies quite enormously, again, depending on the topic. As well, using one rather than two screeners might miss up to 13% of relevant studies. That again will vary depending on whether perhaps you've done some piloting and tested the agreement between reviewers and then divided up screening. That number could be lower. And again, it depends on the clarity of the eligibility criteria. So it's a good idea to pilot screen some references to make sure that everybody's on the same page about interpreting the inclusion criteria, as well as discussing how to resolve conflicts, whether a third person is going to weigh in or you're just going to talk about each one and reach a consensus. So the Cochrane Handbook recommends pilot screening 6 to 8 articles, but they suggest that you intentionally go in and pick out some that look like they're going to be ambiguous and result in some potential disagreement. I personally would probably recommend a larger pilot than that. But in any event, it is a really important thing to do, even if you're using 2 screeners for the full screening process. Some reviews do calculate and report the inter-rater reliability for screening, which 80% is usually considered a good level of agreement, and Covidence will calculate that for you. So some things to think about when you're developing your inclusion criteria include aspects of the PICO. So for population, things like, are you going to limit to one sex, one age group? And if you are looking at quite a particular population, what are you going to do with studies that include your population, but also some other groups? Are you going to try to include those or exclude them entirely? Characteristics of the intervention. Are you looking at any interventions which you might be doing for a scoping review on a topic, say, or is there a specific type of intervention or a specific way that an intervention is delivered that you're only interested in? Outcomes, think about how you're defining outcomes, and as well, are you only interested in literature that's using specific types of measurement of outcomes? Particular types of study design. For some research questions, it might be really appropriate to just limit to, say, randomized controlled trials. For something like a scoping review, it's more common to include a lot of different types of literature, including even reviews. Publication types. So what kinds of grade literature might you include? Is it valuable to include things like conference abstracts or preprints or dissertations? Or do you feel like you have a strong reason to just look at published journal articles? Years of publication, if you do limit by year, you probably should have a good reason for that, whether it's something that's changed in the science based on a particular year, or perhaps the existence of a really good previous review that you feel like you can just look at the literature that's come out since then. And limiting by language. It's very common for people to limit just to English language, but that obviously will introduce quite a bit of bias and be a limitation of your study. So it's kind of like searching, where you're balancing the risk of potentially missing something with needing to have a reasonable number of results to screen that you have the time and resources to tackle. So there are some really excellent resources from a librarian at the University of Toronto, Patricia Ayala, at the link on the slide there. She has a whole 1-hour webinar on developing inclusion and exclusion criteria for your review. So going into much more depth than we are today, I'd really recommend that you take a look at her resources. So I've got a poll for you that I'm going to launch now. So it asks, take a look at these theoretical inclusion criteria for a systematic or scoping review. Do you think that these are clear and robust enough? Okay, it looks like most of you have had a chance to participate, and there was unanimous agreement that no, these are not clear and robust enough for a systematic or scoping review. Does anybody have any thoughts on these criteria that you'd like to share, either in the chat or verbally? how could they potentially be improved? Yes, Arena.
My thought is that PTSD could be described in other terms, or maybe in some sort of like similar condition, or at least like partial symptoms of it. So yeah, if any of those are omitted, we are risking to just miss some data on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, I have some to share. I will bring up the next slide here. That was definitely something that I thought about, that PTSD, well, are you looking for a formal diagnosis of that? Or would you consider, symptoms or sort of self-diagnosed through a self-screening tool? As well, would the PTSD have to be related to somebody's occupation as a physician, or just general PTSD? Some of the other things that came to mind were, I thought original research was a little bit vague. What types of study design, what types of publications, and then what about things that aren't really finished, like studies that are ongoing that you might identify in a clinical trials registry, for instance? Do you want to keep track of those in some way, even though they're not done and can't extract data from? And then what about things like preprints, where the study is finished, but is maybe not in its final form yet because it has not yet been published in a peer-reviewed journal? Also things like the research question is looking at increase in prevalence. What about studies that don't describe any sort of baseline pre-COVID prevalence? Would those be includable or not? A lot of studies might be looking at multiple healthcare professionals, including nurses or other practitioners. What will you do with those if physicians are just a part of the population? Could be that there aren't enough studies on this, on COVID. Would you think about similar pandemics, similar disaster sorts of situations? Probably problematic that it's limited to English language, given that this has been a global pandemic. But on the flip side, there might be reasons to introduce some geographical limitations, just because healthcare systems vary so much around the world, and different countries have been impacted differently by the pandemic. Okay, so I like to try a little exercise, which will take place in the form of polls. I'm going to show you a few abstracts and launch a poll where you'll vote whether, yes, this should be included, no, this should not be included, or maybe I'd need to read the full text. Based on these inclusion criteria. So these are adapted from an actual recently published systematic review, and it's about climate anxiety. And their inclusion criteria were qualitative or mixed method studies on anxiety-related experiences related to climate change. And they specifically are excluding studies about individual phenomena like a natural disaster, sea level rise, or I guess things like crop failure in a particular landscape. So they're thinking about kind of climate change writ large. Also, rejecting any papers that are only quantitative data. And then things like opinion pieces, reviews, and gray literature, those were all excluded. And well, thank you, Vanessa, has added those to the chat, so you'll have them handy. And we can put that to the test, that idea that you can screen a title and abstract within a minute. So I'm going to show the title and abstract for a minute, and you'll have that amount of time to decide yes, no, maybe. Okay, so here's the first one, and I'm going to launch the poll. Okay. Okay, so that's been 1 minute, and looks like 50-50, a yes or no. This study was actually included in the published review. And I'm going to show another one. And I will relaunch the poll for voting on this one. Okay, everybody has voted. And everybody said either no or need to read full text. And yes, this one was not included in the published review. I'm assuming because it's specific to wildfires rather than talking about kind of climate change in general. And then we've got one more. Okay, so most folks thought either no or need to read full text on this one. This was not one of the included studies in the published review, and I'm not really sure why, because they didn't, share that information about potentially excluded studies. Maybe it wasn't qualitative enough. I'm not sure, but in any event, it did not make it into the published review. So I hope that gave you a little bit of a sense of, is a minute really realistic to look at titles and abstracts, and how inclusion criteria might sound clear, but maybe actually be a little bit difficult to apply in practice, or might be quite variable from one person to another. And I just wanted to share that there are a couple of reviews on this topic that had pretty similar inclusion criteria, somewhat similar search strategies, and they ended up with no included studies in common. And that's the one that we were just looking at, as well as another one recently published. This one had about 15 included studies. This one had 6 included studies. And then there's yet another review that was not looking just at climate anxiety. It was looking at any mental health impacts of climate change, but it was only focused on North America. And as well, it was inclusive of things like fires and floods and specific disasters related to climate change. And they screened like 64,000 results and ended up with over 80 included studies. So they did have a librarian involved in their search strategy, but it just kind of goes to show you how variations in how you set up the inclusion criteria, as well as the decisions made during screening, can have a big impact on the final review. So that's it for this section. Were there any questions before we move along? Okay, I will stop sharing my screen.
So thank you everyone for your wonderful participation so far. I'm actually going to start off with a poll. And this is just getting a sense of your experience with critical appraisal tools, which is the next section of our workshop today. So it's just a simple yes or no. Have you used a critical appraisal tool before? And if yes, which one? And if you would be able to add that to the chat, that would be fantastic. Okay, so it looks like we have one person who has used a critical appraisal tool, and if you could just share the name of it in the chat, that would be fantastic. And if you don't remember, that's not a problem. We're going to be looking at quite a few of them momentarily. Okay. I'm going to assume the no answer in the chat is in I don't remember. So I will stop sharing the poll and begin on the wonderful topic that is critical appraisal. So we're going to be talking about several tools and templates that are available and recommended to support this very important process. So what is it exactly? Well, critical appraisal, it's also referred to as quality assessment. It's an objective, analytical evaluation or judgment, in some cases, of the results or our final search results that we hope to include in our final synthesis. And I would go one step further and say that critical appraisal is a systematic evaluation. So one section of the Cochrane guidelines that is quite relevant is Chapter 7. And so if you'll note, they say we draw a distinction between two places in which bias should be considered. The first is in the results of the individual studies, and the second is in the result of the meta-analysis. So all Cochrane reviews attempt to minimize bias, and this is done through a variety of methods, one of the most important being critical appraisal. Okay, so what is it? Why do we need it? How do we do it? Well, critical appraisal, again, it's an objective, hopefully, analytical and scholarly assessment or evaluation of the results you have. And you're looking for validity and applicability to ultimately decide whether you're going to include the studies in your synthesis. The main goal of critical appraisal is to assess the methodological quality of included studies and whether they have the proper methods to limit bias. The criteria can vary, as can the tools used to assess quality based on the types of studies included in the review and the types of methods that are used. So some parameters that are looked at are validity, is it credible? And again, applicability, is it relevant to my population? And so that's obviously very health sciences focused, but essentially, is it relevant to my research question? And so we also look at whether the research question of a given study is clear, whether the method that the study employed is appropriate, if the sample size is appropriate, the quality of the statistics, many elements to determine the strength of the study that you may or may not include. And as with other parts of the systematic review, there should be two people who are independently assessing the quality and deciding disagreements through an established process, consensus, or third party. And of course, however you decide to do that should always be documented. Finally, there should be training and some element of initial testing to make sure that everyone is on the same page and that everyone is assessing from a similar standpoint and being as consistent as possible within the review team. And also, it's a good idea to report the results of your critical appraisal in a table so that they're easily accessible and understandable. And so, just as the quality assessment tool should be specified beforehand, any decisions about excluding low quality studies and where the cutoff will be, this can be many elements, including statistical analyses. These should all be established and laid out with explanations and justifications at the start of the study. Likewise, the results of the quality assessment will be used in the synthesis, the results of the quality assessment, how the results of the quality assessment will be used in the final synthesis should be explained in the protocol. So one thing that we often say is evidence synthesis is only as good as the evidence it synthesizes. And so as much as possible, you want to establish and document decisions about study quality a priori in a protocol. And this will only add quality and strength of rigor to your methods. So you're probably wondering, well, how do I do this? Where do I begin? What or whom do I speak to for expertise? And this is where the tools and resources come in. So there are a lot of tools and a lot of educational materials that help you hone this skill. And critical appraisal is very much a skill that you build over time. One thing that I definitely recommend doing first is checking out these modules that are available through the Cochrane Common Mental Disorders Group, which is based in the University of York. And so what I'm doing today is describing how critical appraisal is involved in the systematic review methodology, but these modules go in depth into the process and offer an excellent introduction and more robust understanding. Beyond those modules, once you get to actually employing the tools, it's important or usually recommended that you use validated tools. So the tools that are validated help you document for reproducibility and transparency. They give you specific and objective criteria and provide consistency. And these validated tools also tend to have substantive descriptions and directions that can help you make sense of what you are trying to make sense of. And so one great resource is the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine Critical Appraisal Tools. You can see that they have critical appraisal workshops worksheets for all different types of reviews, or study types rather. There are also the critical appraisal skills program checklists. And so these are also fantastic. They have really robust training available in this website as well. I highly recommend exploring what they have to offer. There's also the Joanna Briggs Institute critical appraisal tools. And so if you are conducting a scoping review, often you'll be citing Joanna Briggs methodology. And so it might be more apt to use Joanna Briggs. And then finally, there is AmStar. So AmStar is actually a measurement tool to assess systematic review quality. So this is a tool you would want to use if you were doing a review of reviews, often called an umbrella review. It also is a fantastic checklist because you can actually go through it and ensure that your systematic review is meeting all the requirements. And also, of course, if you include systematic reviews or meta-analyses in your synthesis, then you would apply this to your critical, or use this to apply critical appraisal to said study. I recommend all of these. It's really, I would say, get a sense of them and see what best meets your needs. There are a few more tools that you might want to take a look at, especially if you're doing a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. So Cochrane actually has in their handbook an entire chapter, my apology, chapter 7, that provides a great overview of critical appraisal. And then chapter 8 is specific to randomized trials. And I thought I had the link open. I think I do. Here it is. Yeah, so chapter 7 of the Cochrane Handbook is excellent. It provides you with more background on how reviews seek to minimize bias and systematic error, and the difference between what those are and certain things like imprecision, which is random error, or external validity, which is the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized to other populations and settings. For example, a study might be done on a given population that actually doesn't represent with a certain condition as often as another population. So it's interesting as you get to know the more formal nomenclature for the types of error that can occur. And this is a great resource to help you with that. So beyond that kind of foundational knowledge, Cochrane also has 2 fantastic tools. So there's the Risk of Bias 2 tool. So this is just an upgrade to the first one. And they actually have an accompanying BMJ paper that they published. So if you were to use this tool, you would obviously cite it and then trust that it is validated. And then they also have a tool for non-randomized studies. And there's the link to the paper in BMJ. Okay, so now that we have kind of an overview of critical appraisal and risk of bias assessment, we're going to talk about data extraction. So extraction is usually done with some element of automation. Not always, but because research questions differ so vastly and span so many different disciplines now, there's no one-size-fits-all data extraction form. Forms that exist within software are often customizable and you can tailor them to fit your research question. But essentially, the way that you're going to use data extraction tools depends on what the tool is. So using Excel or Google Forms is fantastic. It's obviously completely customizable. You can use Covidence. Covidence is, as you saw with Ursula's great demonstration, what I often refer to more as a project management tool, which is definitely something that you require in a systematic review. Organization is key. Covidence is fantastic because beyond having all of the elements you're able to conduct many elements of the review process within its instance. You can also extract data and really customize what you're looking for from each study type. So you can set up headings, you can set up fields, you can make the fields be text only or a single choice like yes or no. You can set it up to edit at any time. It's really actually improved a lot since its first instance. You can upload PDFs and do data extraction in a side panel. There's still some issues and possible improvements, which they're always improving this tool, so I'm sure they are to come. Something like pre-populating fields, and there are a couple other issues that we've become privy to. I'm going to show you quickly 2 examples of, oops, sorry, it's always the screen with our faces always gets in the way. Okay, so this is an example of a review that the data extraction has already been completed. So I'm going to show you, just so you can get a sense of what it looks like within Covidence, what a data extraction form looks like when completed. So final decision, you've got each reviewer there. You've got the general information, notes, eligibility confirmation. These are all customized parameters. This is an example of a review that hasn't made it to the extraction phase yet. And so what would happen in this instance is I would go to the data extraction template, and then I would set it up. So they have templates. They have really great templates for RCT data extraction forms. But if you have a more novel or nuanced research question, then you can add different elements to your data extraction form and make it completely customizable. If you were to use an Excel sheet or a Google sheet, obviously you would create the table yourself. Common place to start, title, place of publication, date, those types of things, and then you'd get more nuanced based on your research question. Okay, I just want to make sure I haven't missed anything. One other thing is that you need to have the same reviewers. You need to have 2 reviewers doing data extraction and quality assessment. And you want to ensure, again, that the level of training and understanding of the parameters you want to extract are the same. Okay, so one other thing to note is that training and piloting the data extraction is important because once you start, it's difficult to make changes. And as with other parts of the review, all of the data extraction plans should be included in your initial plans and protocols. So again, you want to be painfully transparent and document everything. And what I have here is an example of a scoping review published within the Open Science Framework, which I'm going to demonstrate in a few moments. And this research team has actually published their data extraction empirical protocol. And essentially, they've identified everything they hope to extract a priori, the extraction phase. So it's a really good idea to, again, make sure that everything is open, transparent, and every decision you make is based on pre-established parameters. Okay, so now we are on to data synthesis. So this is what you're here to do, right? You are essentially endeavoring to use repeatable analytical methods to collect secondary data and analyze it. And you can either do this with narrative or descriptive synthesis, or you can use a meta-analysis, which is, as you know, this is statistical component of systematic reviews. Just remember that tables and summaries are fantastic, and that undeniable transparency is always key, and essentially what moves a body of knowledge forward, which is, at the end of the day, what the goal of these reviews are. And if you have any questions about data synthesis or meta-analyses, those are obviously huge topics. We'd be happy to help you after the workshop, or definitely encourage you to get in touch with your subject librarians. Okay, so now we're going to touch on one of my favorite parts of the workshop. It's an ever more complex and intriguing element of academia, and that is reproducibility, transparency, and retractions. So these are all very large topics, and they could easily fill entire courses, to be honest. But today we're just going to touch on some of the ways to achieve them and produce a methodologically sound and useful review, as well as make you aware of retractions and any implications they may have for your research. So, as you know, the main goal of knowledge synthesis is to produce quality evidence that can be applied and used for a specific purpose. And that may change practice or counter existing ontologies within a discipline. The methods used for systematic reviews and related reviews are rigorous, well documented, and the steps include limiting bias with predefined methods, assessing studies for quality, ensuring your team has domain expertise, methodological expertise, and no conflicts of interest, or if there are, obviously explicitly stated. You want to endeavor to increase reproducibility and transparency. I feel like I keep saying this, but with detailed accounting of methods, including portions of the review that are less structured. And then you want to increase effectiveness and application of your really hard work by including stakeholders in many different contexts, and then ensuring a broad range of researchers, students, patients, organizations, community groups can access and use your review. And so, what do I mean by reproducibility and transparency when it comes to these reviews? So obviously we've been talking about reporting and documenting, and that's all really kind of one of the key elements of these reviews. But another thing to note is that there are actually really methodologically sound ways of reporting and not so sound ways. And so what I have here is an example of a systematic review in forestry, and it's a report of their search strategy and protocol. So you can see here that, cursory look, it looks pretty good, but they just have a table of keywords that they've used for each concept of their research question. There's no actual note of how these terms were applied, how Boolean operators were executed. And if you'll note here at the bottom, it says expressions with city were also inverted, city ecosystem, ecosystem and cities. So that's actually, you can do that kind of wordplay with some technical features in databases, which you probably learned in the first workshop. And so while it might be possible to replicate this search, it's pretty impossible to do it exactly as they did it. And so the reproducibility piece is completely unattainable. I often say this, I feel like I say it too often, but a search strategy is like an experimental design. So just as you would design an experiment in a lab and all the steps so that somebody could reproduce it, you want your search strategy to be as reproducible. And so another thing to note, aside from that, is that they chose a year range and also chose to limit the study to English only. And that's fine. That's fine to make those decisions, but you always have to have a rationale. And you need to articulate why you're doing what you're doing or why you're limiting something. There's also a gray literature exclusion, which again, it's a totally fine decision to make. You just need to state why you've done it. It also is interesting to note here that they say that they not all the relevant literature was found. For example, the study by Woolley and Amin was not found in the search, although a similar study was included. To keep the replicability and internal validity of the systematic search, the study was not included in the review. And so what would have been more conducive to a robust review is actually including that paper and reporting it on the Prisma diagram under identification of studies via other methods, which can include known studies or studies found through serendipitous means. Sometimes a Google Scholar search will, snowball into a paper that for whatever reason wasn't found in your search. Another thing to note is that when studies are done, a study is actually separate from the publication. And so when we're searching our databases and great literature sources, if there is a paper or publication about a study, the publication is just linking to the study. And so essentially what I'm trying to say is there may be two publications about the same study. And so being that they did include a paper that was somewhat similar, it may be that they found all the necessary data, but you can't be sure. So those are a few of the problematic non-reproducible aspects of this search reporting. And so now to show you an example of a reporting that is actually really well executed is this education systematic review from the Campbell collaboration. And so what is so fantastic about this is first that they have the details of the search strategy for all bibliographical databases in a supporting information or appendix. And so you are now required, the Prisma update requires you to publish all search strategies for all databases that you've looked at. You also should be reporting on the number of hits per keyword, per subject heading, and per Boolean operator combination. And obviously the reporting of the previous review did not do that. So that's the first thing that shows me that this is a reproducible reporting. Another thing to note is that they've listed all of the databases that they looked at. They have here that they limited their study date as well, but they say the reason. So the reason is that they, the last 30 years had an important educational setting that they wanted to look at. They also provide details of their Google Scholar and relevant web pages search, as well as hand searching of specific article reference lists and journals. And so while these are not necessarily reproducible things or reproducible searches because of the algorithms that are Google and access to journal articles, many reasons that these might not be absolutely 100% replicable, at least they are doing their best to show what they did and how they found what they did. Again, this is an excellent example of being as transparent as possible. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of a somewhat reproducible versus a very reproducible search reporting. And again, the Prisma guidelines are fantastic for helping you with that. Okay, so now we are on to retractions. So what happens when erroneous methods, so the previous two examples, or sorry, not the previous two, the first example of that search report was not the best. And so what might happen is an author might acknowledge that and send in an errata, so an acknowledged mistake in a publication, or a comment might come through from somebody who reviews this and says, hey, you know, we can't replicate the search. This isn't the best methods. And then there are retractions. And so retractions are when publications are found to be completely fraudulent. Data may be misconstrued, or there may be blatant lies about data. I like to think in my heart of hearts that most people don't intend to have the biases or errors that occur, but unfortunately it does occur more often than not. I'll read the general definitions here. So errata are published to correct unintended errors, accepted as errors by the authors. Retraction notices are published usually by a journal editor, where data have been found to be fraudulent. For example, in the case of plagiarism, that's a big one. And then comments are published under a range of circumstances, including when errors are suggested by others and also for early concerns regarding fraud. One thing that happens often in the information science world is a search strategy just done with neglect or a complete lack of rigor will often get flagged by other information professionals. So why is this important to you? Well, whatever studies you decide to include in your final review, you're going to have to consider whether or not to include them based on your quality appraisal, critical appraisal, but also on these retractions. So these can impact the value and conclusions from your review if they are inadvertently included, and they can also be a reason to remove a study from your review. So there might be a paper that looks fantastic as far as your critical appraisal checklists go, but for whatever reason, it may have been retracted. So how do you know? Well, there are a few ways to do this. So one thing you can do is go directly to the databases where your papers exist. And I have an example here. Oops, I hope it didn't time out. Okay, good. And so this is an example search looking at urinary tract infections. So we've got a subject heading, our keywords with a proximity operator. And so there's 66,000 papers. And so what I'm now doing within that database is looking at retraction of publication as publication type, retracted publication as publication type, expression of concern, and then expression of concern, all fields. And you could also test using different combinations of retraction. There are different various ways that it is stated. You don't want to get too crazy because then you'll bring in outliers. But within those 66,000, when I end that with those publication types, 20 come back as problematic papers. So this is a fantastic way to really quickly get a sense of whether or not, or what exists within your subject area that have been retracted, and then you could easily just test individual papers this way. Another thing to note is that the Cochrane guidelines, so the Cochrane handbook, has a fantastic chapter 3.9, on identifying fraudulent studies and other retracted publications. And so they go into a lot more detail about different search parameters that you can execute to find them. And then there's a little bit more detail about how they occur within the RCT world, randomized controlled trials. And I definitely suggest that you take a look at that chapter. It's pretty quick, or section rather, it's not an entire chapter even, 3.9. So those are the ways to kind of navigate the commercial databases to see whether or not a paper has been retracted or deemed problematic. Another fantastic tool, I'm not sure if any of you are aware of it, is Retraction Watch. So Retraction Watch is essentially what it sounds like. It's an accounting of all papers that have been retracted. And so if you have any interest in this realm, you can sign up for daily or weekly notices of retracted papers and different fraudulent things that have occurred in academia. They have this fantastic database that you can use to search. I'm just going to search within the title COVID-19 so you can get a sense of what it can do for you. It's obviously, it doesn't have the bells and whistles of Ovid Medline, but it does produce 219 retraction notices. And what I love about this is that it has this lovely table that gives you not only the author and associated universities and stakeholders, but the reasons. So this was retracted because there were concerns or issues about the data. This was retracted bias issues or lack of balance, among other issues. So it's a fantastic tool. And also, if you are in the publishing world or just have any interest in how these kind of appear, I would definitely advise that you take a look at it. They claim that they're tracking retractions as a window into the scientific process. So it can become actually even quite philosophical. They have great user guides, and then they even have a retracted coronavirus papers section. So definitely you can take a look at that, or if you want to understand this problem more in depth. And then finally, beyond those two ways to identify retractions, there is Zotero. So Zotero is a citation management tool that does actually flag retractions. So that is kind of those three things in tandem. You can be pretty sure that you are keeping apprised of those. Okay. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is publishing and knowledge translation. So in medicine, knowledge translation is defined as the process for using evidence in practice and decision-making, thereby strengthening health systems and improving health outcomes. But knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization, as it sometimes is called, go much beyond health sciences. It is a dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge, and is actually truly one of my passions and priorities as a researcher and librarian. It's kind of why we do this work, or why I do this work, but essentially, it is a big component of the systematic review process. So when you think about knowledge translation, it's really important to think about equity as well. And today I'm going to focus on accessibility of research findings and data and increasing the chances that your review can actually be used and applied. So this actually also gets at impact as well as equity. And when thinking of equity, ideally we're hoping to move research in directions where certain groups are not excluded from research. And we want to make sure that research participants and communities that are most affected by a given research topic will actually be able to apply the research and access it. And we also want to ensure that other researchers and professionals can access, regardless of their institution's journal subscription. So some institutions like UBC or U of T have access to a lot, whereas smaller universities with different budget and funding models may not have access. So how do we ensure that we do this? Well, we want to consider demographic representation, the distribution of effects of our study, and then also implications for equity and generalizability. We want to make sure that our review is used and applied, includes users, stakeholders, patients, all of anyone who might be impacted by research. And we want to make the products of our research accessible or open access, openly available. And then we'll also want to review resources on knowledge translation and more in-depth tools and resources available to us beyond this workshop. Okay, so another important piece to think about is, so beyond this notion of equity of access, we also want to think about equity of process. So recently, a new EDI framework in knowledge synthesis was created by Dr. Andrea Trico, who is actually a knowledge synthesis scientist at U of T, or in Toronto. I believe she teaches at U of T, but has a couple of other affiliations. And this is essentially a diagram communicating what we should all be moving towards within our knowledge syntheses. So what I like about this diagram is it shows you at each stage of the systematic review process how to implement these EDI parameters. So during protocol development, you want to ensure that your team is representative of the topic. You want to complete self-reflective exercises, consider equity as the main focus or sub-focus, and consider theoretical lenses through which you'll be writing your manuscript. At the literature search stage, you want to use equity-specific filters and databases. At the screening phase, you want to ensure that your eligibility and criteria may focus on equity dimensions. At the data abstraction phase, you want to use the progress plus variables or consider intersectionality. At the risk of bias or critical appraisal stage, you want to consider if studies powered correctly for equity. And this is a piece that may not actually even exist on those templates that we link to, so you might want to add that. And then finally, at the data synthesis phase, you want to ensure that you conduct appropriate sex and gender-based analysis, report using the PRISMA equity or sex and gender equity and research guidelines, and then ensure that this whole entire circle is very self-reflective. Okay, so now that you have that kind of foundational knowledge of knowledge translation, making research available and accessible, doing it through this newly found EDI framework, which I love, I'm going to talk a little bit about some resources that are available to you for depositing or making your research available. So the first thing I'm going to speak to is Circle. So Circle is UBC's open access repository. It's a fantastic resource or database where you can publish your dissertations, instructional materials, systematic reviews, and it actually, even supplemental materials, it provides long-term preservation and a persistent link to your work. It increases access, use, and application of your work, which is what we're striving towards, and you retain the rights to your work. So what I'll demonstrate quickly in Circle is just, I'm going to look for scoping review protocol. So this database actually indexes across quite a few it pulls in from some journal content. So that's why there are 8,000 results. But you can see here that it's easy to identify the scoping review protocols. And so you can make your protocol available in Circle, especially if you're not doing a health sciences review and you can't use Prospero or other avenues of publishing a protocol. And again, you retain the rights to it. Another vehicle for enabling equity of access is the Open Science Framework. So the Open Science Framework is also very much itself a project management tool. You can publish protocols, data, supplemental materials, posters from conferences. In fact, at UBC Okanagan, we had an interdisciplinary health conference that was online, and we were able to make the poster session open on OSF. So it still virtually had that sense of, going poster to poster. So there's a lot of novel and creative ways you can use it. It's especially useful for documenting the entire cycle of your research project, which only enhances transparency and adherence to methodology, something that, in case you didn't know, is very important. Again, can't stress enough, having everything open is so powerful. You can also register your protocol on the OSF. Again, if those other more traditional avenues are not available to you. And I'll show you an example of the OSF being used for just what I've described. So this is an example of a scoping review that colleagues of ours at U of T have used the OSF to document their process with. So, oops, this isn't the one that I was looking for. My apology. Here it is. Okay, so this is, I'll show you this first. So what I love about this is they not only included their actual screening documents, but they actually have like a cheat sheet for their review team for how they were to approach each study that they were extracting or screening rather. And so what I like about this is you can actually look at each reviewer's comments for each paper, and you can see here that one reviewer said to include and one reviewer said to exclude. And so this seems like a pretty minimal piece of the entire process, but if there were ever a question or stipulation about why or why not a study was included, this is all public facing and somebody could go to it and see how the decision was made. I'll just go back a couple of levels within this project. So you can see they've got their first level of screening documents available, but then they also have in their, we were looking at their second level. They've got instructions for screening, and then previous to this level in the OSF, they've got all of their search strategies. Sorry, I think that I might not be able to get out of this this part of the of their project, but essentially they have everything documented and available. Oh, here we go. So it's a scoping review, barriers and facilitators for early career researchers completing systematic and scoping reviews. But yes, you can see they've got their screening criteria, their search strategies, presentations, their preprint, which they actually made available on OSF, data abstraction. So everything is available. And OSF is fantastic for that. It's also great. It's a great collaborative tool. So you don't have to make everything public. If you wanted to use it for a project that's not a review, I highly recommend it. And we also offer workshops on the OSF if you needed a little bit more direction. Okay, so I think that's it for me. I definitely am open to any questions you have. Before we dive into questions though, I just wanted to make you aware of all of the resources available through UBC Library Research Services. So the first is the Open Science Framework. That's a direct link to UBC's iteration. Circle, again, is our institutional repository. Scholarly communications can help you with questions about copyright, publishing, many other things. There's a group of librarians there who are available for consults. We have a data management team that can help you with that. But beyond that, there's actually a new data management plan template for systematic reviews that the Portage Network, which is a data management, they're a group that have really been working towards data management transparency within the research in academia. And this is a really great guide to using the data management plan template for systematic reviews. And so you might want to ask, or you might be asking, with everything I'm documenting and making available, why do I need to do this? Well, how you're going to manage the data that you use for your knowledge synthesis. Some journals require a plan, and it just helps you stay organized, and it's good for again, any issues with documenting. If you have a plan, it will likely address those. So that's a direct link to the guide as well as the template. And then, of course, if you ever need anything, we've got our directory of subject librarians. So depending on your discipline, you would just want to find your accompanying librarian and get in touch with them. Usually email is best. And then there's one other piece, which is that I forgot to mention in the meta-analysis component, that the Department of Statistics, I believe, has free and fee-based services. So if you are doing a meta-analysis and have minimal statistical prowess, then I would definitely recommend getting in touch with them. I believe when I was in Vancouver that they did offer an hour to graduate students, but I'm not sure if that remains. So definitely take a look at these resources, and thank you so much.